making their beautiful facility available this morning. And also thank Jim Finger, who is president of the American Ambulance Association, for being here, Dan Mance, who is the Vermont EMS State Director, Christy Oxholm, who's president of the Vermont State Firefighters Association, Dean Gilmore, who's chair of the Vermont State Firefighter Association's Government Relations Committee, and Bernie Du Bois, who's chair of the Vermont State Firefighter Association's Recruitment and Retention Committees. Let me begin by not only thanking Jim, Dan, Christy, Dean, and Bernie for the outstanding work that they are doing, but more importantly, to thank the 5,600 volunteer firefighters and emergency medical personnel throughout our state who risk their lives and provide vital services as first responders. These men and women, in my view, are true heroes. They and 800,000 other volunteer firefighters and emergency medical service personnel throughout our country save lives and property and are there when we need them 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We owe them all a very deep sense of gratitude as they make personal and financial sacrifices to keep our community safe. And if there's one point I want to make today, I think it's, in a certain sense, we take for granted what these folks do. They are volunteers. They are called in the middle of the night. Suddenly, out of nowhere, their lives are in danger as they're fighting a fire. And they do this as volunteers, and they do it with pride. And we should very much appreciate what they do and thank them very much for doing that. Volunteer firefighting has been a tradition in our state, in our country, since the formation of America. But today, for a variety of reasons, that institution is in trouble. A 2007 report by the U.S. Fire Administrator described volunteer emergency services as a, quote, tradition in danger of weakening and possibly even dying out, end of quote, and noted a drop of more than 97,000 volunteers since 1984. The simple truth is that volunteer fire departments and EMS services in Vermont and throughout the country are finding it increasingly difficult to retain and recruit the members they need. There are a number of reasons for that. A lot of them have to do with economics. People are pressed economically, and they still just don't have the time to volunteer their services. Another reason is cultural. The reality is, as we all understand, is that our kids do not necessarily have the same lifestyle as their parents do. But whatever the reason may be, what is very clear is that if this trend continues, if volunteer fire departments find it increasingly difficult to retain and recruit. Now, last week, I introduced the Volunteer Firefighter and EMS Support Act of 2009. This legislation directs the Secretary of Homeland Security to establish a program to provide matching funds to any state or local governments or nonprofit associations in support of volunteer firefighters and EMS personnel incentive programs. The federal government would provide for half of the cost of the incentives, which could include retirement benefits, travel and training reimbursement, health insurance assistance, life insurance, tuition, and school loan forgiveness, and property tax reductions. Now, some or all of these benefits are provided in some communities all over America, but there's no uniformity to it. So what we think is if the federal government begins to step in and provides half of the help to a state government or a local community, it could be a real shot in the arm for local firefighters to be able to attract the personnel and the volunteers that they need. So that's where we are right now. And let me just conclude by saying that we have worked on this legislation with communities, volunteer firefighters throughout the state of Vermont and nationally as well. And this legislation is strongly supported by the National Volunteer Fire Council and the American Ambulance Association.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. One thing I can say for sure is Senator Sanders has always been a very big supporter of EMS and fire, and we appreciate you for that. There's many things that we are always asking for, and you're always the first in line to make sure that the needs are taken care of. On behalf of the Vermont Ambulance Association and the American Ambulance Association, I'd like to thank Senator Sanders for introducing the Volunteer Firefighters and EMS Support Act. A significant number of governmental and non-governmental EMS agencies in Vermont and around the country rely on volunteer labor to provide life-saving pre-hospital care. Due to the large size of the service areas for most EMS agencies, many of them do not have access to large labor pools and cannot find enough volunteers in a condensed area, so we need that can provide the high quality care. If they weren't for volunteers, they wouldn't be able to do it. We appreciate the support for this. This legislation will help correct that problem, we hope, with the recruitment and retention, so that they're able to provide some benefits to keep them to do it, because it is very tough in these times to get volunteers. On behalf of the Vermont Ambulance Association and the American Ambulance Association, I would tell you that we're in full support, and we thank you for your support.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your attention to this important initiative. Within the Department of Health, we recognize that maintaining an adequate emergency services workforce in the fire and EMS worlds is important to the public health and safety of Vermont. I talk to volunteer service chiefs around the state on a daily basis. I am unaware of any department in this state that has volunteer personnel that couldn't use more people or wouldn't want to keep the people they've got longer. Everyone is looking for tools, and I think this legislation represents a new tool in the toolbox to help keep and attract volunteer personnel.
First off, I'd like to welcome everybody here to the Shelburne Fire Station, because in addition to being president of the State Firefighters Association, I am a very proud member of this department. This is a station that is staffed by volunteers, some of whom have literally decades of service. Shelburne's also very lucky to be served by dedicated volunteer emergency medical personnel, some of whom have also provided decades of service. And being able to recognize and reward that kind of service to the community with incentive programs would help departments not just in Vermont, but around the country to recruit and retain membership. When fire departments and emergency medical agencies are staffed with experienced members, the benefit isn't just to those personnel or those departments, but to the communities they serve.
First, I'd like to thank Senator Sanders for inviting myself, the Vermont State Firefighters Association, and the Vermont Fire Chiefs Association to be involved in writing and presenting this legislation. It has been an honor to work with Senator Sanders and his staff both here in Vermont and Washington. This legislation will provide a tool for our communities in retaining the fire and EMS volunteers we have, as well as recruitment and retention for new volunteers. It will allow our communities to offer a wide range of benefits to the volunteers that invest numerous hours doing what it takes to protect the people and property of this country. In reality, it would be our country investing in fire and EMS volunteers that invest their lives to protect them.
Historically, volunteer fire and rescue services have played an important role in protecting our communities. Millions of people at some point in their lives have depended upon the services of such volunteers to protect life and property. The nation's fire service is on the verge of a crisis as constantly increasing demands are placed upon our emergency responders. At the same time, today's economic conditions make it extremely difficult to retain highly trained personnel and recruit new emergency response members. The dismal economic times that this country is now facing dictates that small-town USA will always have to rely on its volunteer emergency responders. Neighbors helping neighbors means as much today as any time in the past. I applaud Senator Sanders' efforts on our behalf.
I just want to thank, again, all of the people who are here and all of the people who have spoken. As I said before, these are real heroes and heroines in the state of Vermont, and we too often take them for granted. And everybody in rural Vermont and rural America should understand that when they call 911 at 3 o'clock in the morning because there's a fire or somebody had a stroke, these are the people in Vermont and throughout this country who respond. And right now, this institution is in trouble. They are having increasingly difficult times retaining and attracting the people that they need to provide the quality of services that they must provide. And at the federal government, we made some progress in this way or that way, but clearly not enough. and the time is now for us to play a stronger role.